The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Keep your mission on your mind and your mind on your mission. This is Mission Minded with Michael Coleman.
One of my favorite times of the week, and you can see his big hand right there on his camera. He is arranging things so he can get his good side here on our YouTube channel, Tony Kurre. Tony Kurre Radio, Heart of Alabama Food Bank CEO. Michael Coleman joins us here for Mission Minded. Keep in mind your mission on your mind. We do this show every single week. We talk about business. We also have a show called Bite by Bite, which is specific to Feeding America and, of course, the Heart of Alabama and food insecurities. And we'll do that right after this show. But you can find both of them on podcasts, wherever you get it, and right here on our YouTube channel, which is, by the way, by far the most viewed or listened to portion of this, because obviously people love to see our beautiful faces and how handsome we are. So that's a good thing. Michael, how you doing? Everything good?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Just coming off a week of vacation and spent a couple of days down at the beach. Although it was double red flags the whole time because of the riptides and sharks.
Yes.
But as a matter of fact, right after we left, three fathers actually came down from Birmingham, and they had just checked into the hotel. They said, "Hey, let's go get something to eat." And they're like, "Well, before we do that, why don't we go for a quick swim?" All three of them drowned in the riptide.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And there's a much better shot at obviously dying from a riptide than there is from a shark bite. But
especially if you're not used to it. I mean, I spent a lot of time down in the Panama City area growing up, and as a young man, and so you were always told. I've had the riptide.
It's scary.
Feet out from under me. Yeah, It's scary because you feel like you're being pulled out, but you just have it drilled in your head that, okay, you just relax, don't fight, just let it pull you, and then get oriented and recognize. And don't try to swim directly back inshore,
sure,
but swim parallel to the coast, and you'll swim out of it eventually, and then you can come back. But number one, if you're not used to that. Number two, when you get flipped upside down and you aren't ready for it, it's very disorienting and can be upsetting. And so it's just hard to know how you'll respond. Can you think calmly through an ordeal like that? And that's one of the double red flags, at least in Florida, mean that you'll be arrested if you're caught in the water. I mean, it's how serious they are. Single red flag means, hey, don't get in the water. There's problems, but
you can still go.
If they catch you out there, they're gonna haul you off to jail.
Yeah, it's funny because, and maybe this is more of a swimming thing because you don't have a lot of time to think about it. But I always think of that word panic. I was watching some show the other night where some guy was actually scuba diving inside of a pyramid. I think it was Expedition, whatever that Josh Gates thing. And he's a little claustrophobic. And so he's actually going under submerged. And they're like, the number one thing is don't panic. First of all, it messes up your breathing, right, which will take up your oxygen. And if you've ever scuba dived and you do kind of freak out because it's you have to acclimate yourself to breathing underwater. It just doesn't feel right. It's just weird. Right. Once you get used to it, then you're good. But yeah, the panic aspect of it, and that goes for falling in pools or anything else. But normally, water. Let me ask you this, since you brought it up. In the world of business, is there any time that you'd ever want to panic, or is there any other time that you've thought you don't ever want to panic? But has there ever been a time that you've panicked in business? Because panic seems like it's knee jerk. It's something I have to do right now. And obviously, when you're swimming, you can drown. You can't drown in your office. But is where does panic play into the business world?
Well, it's when you see things that are affecting life and limb. Somebody gets hurt on the job, their life is hanging in the balance. Usually with operational type things, if it's not life or limb, but it's just, hey, this needs to be addressed immediately. You see some things. Yeah, you try not to move in a panicked way, because it's just like that. When you're moving in a panic, it's hard to take in all this around you and all that's happening. You get so almost blind. It's almost like I've seen dogs, and the way they describe it is when a dog just sees red, the dog doesn't hear you anymore. You could be calling that dog off, but if a dog attacks another dog or attacks a person, it's like they only see red and you can't unlock their jaws. They're just so fixated on it. You don't ever want to be that, especially if you're the leader, because then you don't, you can expedite your actions, but you don't want to haul off in a panic, because then you're closed off to not only what's happening, but people's response to what's happening. Because oftentimes people can respond to something very serious and make the situation worse because they're not thinking clearly. And so you can duplicate problems, somebody getting electrocuted and somebody else coming over there and grabbing them themselves, those kind of things, trying to help, but just not thinking clearly. So, yeah, those kind of things are, you want to, even though you may be pretty jittery on the inside, and there's been times I've been pretty jittery on the inside, I try to keep a perspective that if it's not somebody's life or limb in danger, then everything else is going to take care of itself.
All right. Well, there is something out there, and it's true, because it does seem like things end up taking care of themselves. And obviously there's some things that we need to do from a business standpoint to make things more equitable and more even, if you will, even keel in the world of business. And DEI, I think, was created for that. DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are other ones called JEDI, which is justice, equity, diversion, inclusion. There's equality in Britain, EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion. So any of those words you can kind of jumble around. First of all, why was DEI created? And I know from a political standpoint, it's certainly, it's looked at a little different, but the University of Alabama recently just let go of a lot of people because of their DEI program. I guess I'd call it a program. And then we'll get into what exactly is changing with this program, which I think a lot of people thought was a good idea when it first started, I think.
Yeah, I think really the push for it, if you'll remember, most people may not remember DEI coming around, but they do remember George Floyd incident.
Sure.
And I know that there's radically different views on what happened during that time, but police officers were convicted of either manslaughter or murder. I don't remember. I think it was manslaughter, but anyway, serving prison time because of it. And so everybody, when we started going through the cancel culture, everybody got very sensitive. And so the idea came about, how do we make sure that everyone has a seat at the table? So you start seeing colleges, even years ago, Harvard dropped the SAT because they had become convinced that was biased towards people of color. And it's interesting that Harvard is bringing back the SAT because they recognize you have to have some standard of evaluation to be able to bring people in other than skin color. Before I get into this, so let me just dig into this DI just for a little bit. On the surface, I was very much in favor of DI because when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what came to my mind was, look, there are some people on the outside who don't have just access to normal everyday things. So let me kick it back. This is South Alabama we're in. I'm going to kick it back many, many years ago. There were a good example would be, there were a lot of government jobs that were really controlled. There was not a fair hiring practice. You could have, your brother could have gotten you a job. You could have eventually moved all the way to the top. And then you're holding on, and then you kind of name your own replacement, and it's a good old boy system. So there were a lot of people who were prevented from getting good government jobs with good, pensions and retirement. Not just that, but contracting as well. Because until the government came along and said, hey, you are required to do a certain amount of minority contracts, and, if they're federal, if they're government, lots of times you have a good old boy system inside of that, and the same people getting the same contracts and they're benefiting. And you have people on the outside, oftentimes, not always people of color, but for whatever reason, they're on the outside and they don't get a fair shot at these kind of contracts. And so you're like, hey, we just recognize that's innately not fair. It's not based on their work or that, hey, these contractors are better. You don't have any idea. So when you hear stories like that, you're like, well, I'm all in favor of everybody getting a chance to bid on a job, for everybody having a fair chance at government jobs, for everybody to that's kind of been ostracized, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that they have the opportunity to come and be a part, take a part of that system. But what's happened is you now have, I think, 12 states. I could have this wrong. I think 12 states that have now outlawed. I know Florida and Alabama and North Carolina. Alabama recently did it, where you outlawed DEI because the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion has ended up becoming something vastly different than at least what the words say. So if you just break those down, so let's take the idea of diversity. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm going to give you how I just naturally felt when I heard about that, which is when I'm going to do anything, I would think it's naturally healthy that I want people who as much diversity in the room. And I'm not talking, when I say that, I don't mean just racial diversity. What I mean is different experiences, different perspectives, introverts, extroverts, people who are type A, type B, as much diversity so that when you look at a problem, you're kind of hitting it from every idea. And that's the idea to me of diversity. But what ends up happening is you get, if you get so fixated on racial diversity, but if the racial diversity, if they all end up thinking alike, yes, they're racially different, but of the same process, the same thinking, the same mindset. So you're not getting diversity of thought, you're just getting diversity of race. And so that began to happen in a lot of places. And then you establish places of color. And so there were universities where white people would come in, and there's even videos of this where white people would come in because you started using things like white privilege. Mm-hmm. And every problem experienced in the world was ultimately the fault of a system that was created by white people for white people. And so therefore, everything that was wrong with society and everything that had ever happened to a person of color became the fault of people with white skin. At least this is the argument on that side of the aisle.
Yeah.
And so you would see videos cropping up at universities where they're like, no, you have to leave. This is a restricted area for people of color. Don't bring your white privilege in here. And so there were white students who were being banned from certain areas and certain activities and doing certain things. And so when you go back and say, wait a minute, the idea of inclusion is including everybody. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. You know, the idea is, hey, we want everybody to have an opportunity. But what began to happen was it became a radical movement in many places, not with all people, but it was about let's elevate people of color and make sure that everything is put in place for their advantages, and screw the evil white people, because that's what's wrong with this world right now is all the white people who are involved. And so it's a very delicate issue. And again, when I look back as somebody from South Alabama, I go back and I totally get the idea of that. We have a terrible racial history. I get that. I know that decisions were made that people of color were excluded. I 100% get all that. And I want to make sure that things are put into place to overcome that. But where I think we are as a society today, of course, there's always going to be differences and there's always going to be racial challenges. But I'm for a system that says, let's create a system where everybody has the same opportunity. So let's just go back. If I'm a contractor, I want you to have the opportunity to bid, but I want everything to be done based on merit. That's how you have true equality. If you invite everybody to the table, then we want the best employee, we want the best contractor, we want the highest skilled person, on and on and on. Now, and I'm kind of going back and forth, but the counter to that is, okay, well, with all things being equal, people tend to hire people that look like them, that think like them, that sound like them. And is that something to be considered? Absolutely. But if you then say, okay, we're going to have certain quotas based on race, well, let's say that you then say, okay, regardless of how good companies are, we're going to have, for every 5 contracts, 2 of those are going to be issued to minorities. So what you're now doing is you've gone beyond creating the equal opportunity for everybody to bid on a job. What you've now done is determined equal outcomes. And the problem is, and where that causes such division and problems, is outcomes are not going to be equal. And there's a million different factors as to why outcomes are not equal, but under DEI, oftentimes it's simply reduced down to race. I didn't get this contract because you're white and I'm black, and without a deeper analysis of why each thing is. I will tell you, this is related. In the world, when you're talking about employment, Alabama is a right-to-work state, as the majority of our states are right-to-work states. But anybody who is terminated by me, I know that they have a certain amount of time, I think it's 6 months, to go file an EEOC complaint.
Yeah.
But the people who have standing are people with special recognition or special qualifications or special characteristics, which means if you're a person of color, then, or you are of a different gender, female gender, then you can kind of have, like, regardless if you can link it or not, you can at least file the complaint and say, I was fired because I'm a woman. I was fired because I'm black or Hispanic or Asian or whatever it is, and my boss doesn't like Asians. And then you put forth, but I cannot begin to tell you, I've probably had over my life, probably 4, I think, EEOC complaints. And thankfully I've learned to document all my stuff, but basically what EDI or DEI oftentimes causes people to do is say, I failed in life, therefore that's not fair to me. So I've got to find a reason I failed. And guess what? It's the white guy's fault because he fired me or she fired me because I'm black, Hispanic, disabled. It's not always race or whatever. It's a reason. And I think we really have, DEI is really creates way more division than it does unity, because it says, I'm not where I am in life and I've got to find somebody to blame. It's somebody's fault, not my own fault. And it's the evil, oftentimes white person. And that becomes very problematic when you're trying to, as a white person, you're trying to lead equitably and make sure that there's fair opportunities. And yes, I'll stand right with the African American who says, yeah, but sometimes you're blind. You have blind spots. And I'm like, amen, you're right. Mm-hmm. I do. So I'm not against the safeguards of the EEOC to make sure that there's fairness of opportunity. I don't oppose. I think we all should be educated on just being aware and make sure that we don't have these hidden biases, if you will. Because I will tell you, I don't think I have hidden biases, But then I've had people point out things and I have to go, well, we all have biases. We all have preferences. And then I go, well, you know what? Maybe I need to look harder at myself. But this whole movement is out of control because what it's trying to do is create further division, and it's trying to create this equity of outcome. And it's been so problematic. States are just finally pushing back and just outlawing DEI.
And thank you for explaining that. And I wanted to let you go because I know a lot of people that are listening right now are probably strong opinion one way or another. Listen, in most cases, when you create something like this, it was created for a good intention. Intentions are great. Intentions are always good. And and I think this country is roughly 17, 18, 19% African American. So you're saying 1 in 5?
Oh, it's not that high. It's only about 13%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then maybe it's gay people.
Well, maybe.
Sorry.
Maybe.
Sorry. It probably is.
Somebody's 18 or 19%. I don't know who it is.
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking 17 to 20% black people in Birmingham, which is probably a little closer. Anyway, let's say just for sake of numbers, 1 in 5 people are African American, and so when you look at numbers, you would like to think in a perfect world that 1 in 5 people who get fired or hired for a particular job would be African American, because that would be now depending on what part of the country you live in. Obviously, there are parts of the country where they're 80% African American. There are parts where there is 95% white. I certainly understand that. It's funny. We worked for a classic rock station. I did for 35 years. We had to hire at least 2 black people on our staff.
Yeah.
As part of the FCC rules and regulations. And it was pretty much a done deal. We had to have someone on air. Well, do black people like classic rock? Well, sure they do. You don't think they do, but they certainly do. And so every classic rock station that I ever knew of, and there had to be 50, had a black guy working overnights.
Yeah.
Because that was where you could kind of hide the black person, because the black person sounded different. And so it was.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it was done for the right reasons, and I think it's still a rule in place. Where does affirmative action come into play on all of this? Because
it's the same thing. If you're like, and again, I understand why, because if I'm a business owner and I only hire white people because they look like me, they sound like me, they dress like me, they get the humor, whatever, it's just more comfortable. Then I don't have to learn another culture. I don't have to learn another perspective. And so what ends up happening is then, again, people are pushed outside. At least that's the premise of bringing in that says, no, you have to have we're going to be looking at your total employment. If you're over this many employees, we're going to look at your racial breakdown, gender breakdown, all those kind of things. It gets reported to the government. If you're over 50 employees, it gets reported regularly what all that is. And so affirmative action is not just employment, it's school attendance. At Harvard, again, they outsmart themselves all the time, but they were like, we're going to show you how much we are. We're going to get rid. We think that the ACT or the SAT are biased. They're flawed. We're no longer going to judge people by that. And I'm like, okay. So if you're not going to, and others were saying, we're not going to use grades. And I'm like, okay. So then how do you determine who are the people who are best suited to come into college and advance? Because here's the reality. There's lots of people who are not suited for college for whatever reason, of all races. And you're not doing somebody a favor. I'm not talking about somebody who's really smart and driven, but they're in poverty. They don't have the ability. I'm not talking about that kind of person. I'm talking about a person who is just not wired, is not going to be successful for whatever reason in college. That's why you have, based on past academic performance, based on test scores and all that. And they just do away with that and said, okay, we're going to make sure you're not biased. So I'm just making this up. 20% of your people have to be people of color or African American, and then you have to have 10%, whatever it is. Now, it's interesting when you see some of how it's broken out. we're very selective in our country about what we emphasize in terms of affirmative action. Like, for instance, the NBA, for instance, is dominated by African Americans. Mm-hmm. Should we have a certain amount of Hispanics, a certain amount of Asians, a certain amount of white people, and all that, to have this? I mean, just to be consistent. Yeah. And people go, no, I don't want some 5'10" Asian guy out there on the court just because I've got to have an Asian on every team. Nobody wants that. You want the people who are the best basketball players. You get the best competition. And if everybody on that team happens to be African American, then so be it. I mean, you don't want to force people on there for the sake of diversity. And so same thing with football, same thing with other sports. But there's this constant, in hockey, they're starting to see more African Americans, but why is there no African Americans? Well, lots of places in the North there are. You go to the state of Minnesota, outside of, you can get in some urban areas like Minneapolis, St. Paul, but there's just no African Americans growing up ice skating in the North and places like that. I mean, there's reasons. It's not because there's a bias. It's because the states that are more populated with African Americans, and I think Alabama was the fifth highest with 38%, I think is the last statistics I saw on this. There's just no ice hockey. It's just not something that's done here. Yeah. But people just instantly go to the race. I don't get to do this because of my race, or I don't get to do this. I saw, this was a white person, and she had tattoos all over her face, and she had piercings all over her and studs all over her face, and had across her neck a demonic tattoo.
Sure.
Very clearly she was in the practice the occult and all that. And she says, she went to go apply for a job, and they said, no, I'm sorry, we don't have a position open for you. And she wonders, was it about my tattoo? And I'm sitting there going, well, yeah. I mean, I'm just going to tell you, of course it was about your tattoo, because nobody wants their brand associated with the occult. Nobody wants you interacting with the cult, with customers, when you've got this devil stuff coming out of your neck. And so lots of times people are like, hey, I want to maintain, I want to speak like I want to. I want to act like I want to. I want to do everything you want to. And the business owner's going, okay, fine. But this is what I'm looking for here. Mm-hmm. And so there's that element. And that's white, black.
And that was the other point I was going to talk about. So on top of affirmative action, a lot of times you want to hire people that are speaking to your customer. And exactly. if your customer is primarily white, and I don't know what, I can't think of a widget or whatever that would be primarily a white situation, but depending on what part of town you're living in, let me ask you this too. I think this is interesting. Have you ever thought it was a good idea that we forced segregation? And what I mean by that is forced blacks and whites to get to know each other. Well,
so I think segregation.
And I know we have to be careful here, but I mean, we're just having an honest conversation. Some of my best friends are black. I've got a lot, so I've heard that a million times. Yeah. And this is a touchy subject for a lot of people, but and I say that only because I moved into a neighborhood that is primarily African American. It's certainly more black than it is white, and I've met more black people, I think, in the last year and a half since I moved in this neighborhood than I've ever met in my entire life. And I enjoy it. I don't look at my neighborhood any differently. Yeah. I know some people would. I've lived in neighborhoods where it was all white, and then black people started moving in, and it made people uncomfortable, which is really, really sad. It's purely a power thing, but I am blessed. And happy to know that I have met that, my kids are on a school bus with black kids and black kids are with white kids. And it's the whole daycare. It's the whole daycare thing, right? I mean, when you got 6 or 7 kids, you got a Latino, you got an Oriental, you have a black kid, you have a white kid, you have a Spanish, and they're all in a daycare. Everyone loves each other. They're all getting along. It's all good until
if you put all the kids together. And one of my favorite all-time memes is a black kid and a white kid. And the black kid has a very close shaved head. And I'm talking about, these are 4-year-olds in kindergarten. And the white kid shaved his head because he wanted to see if they could fool the teacher, because they were best friends and wanted to try to fool the teacher. Of course, one's black, one's white. Look, I know it's not a perfect world, and that on both sides we are brought up, and if you've been racially profiled and you've been scarred through racial incidences, you're going to probably teach a black child not to trust white people. And white people are guilty sometimes of going by black stereotypes, on and on and on. There's, they learn all that as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
It would be wonderful, but we just know the evils of this world involved in the. So I said that before I start rambling, to go back to about the segregation thing. I'm glad segregation happened, because without it, we at least started providing better opportunities to people and give and treat African Americans and people of color, giving them opportunities that they deserved, recognizing their contributions to society and the workforce, doing all the things that they do to make the world better. But I think what's happened now is the pendulum has really swung to where it's a political movement. It's militaristic.
Mm-hmm.
It's very divisive. Let me just give you one quick example. I highlighted something in an article I was reading. Colorado University at Boulder has a DEI program, and this is part of the training manuals, and it says the basic predicate of CU Boulder's DEI program is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, students are failing because of white supremacy culture. And so then it says, what is white supremacy culture? According to CU's Boulder documentation, it includes individualism, perfectionism, a sense of urgency, worship of the written word, and objectivity. These traits are supposedly vestiges of whiteness and unavailable to racial minorities, and an unintentionally bigoted attitude. Now, what's happened is they offer resources and training like how to be a better white person. Step 1, realize you're white. Step 2, recognize your privilege. Step 3, know things. Finally, how to be an ally to racial minorities. And they talk about institutionalized whiteness and white privilege and white fragility and on and on and on. So when you start talking about that individualism and an objectivity, think about this for a second. I heard this years ago, actually. A math teacher said that math is racist. 2 + 2 is racist. Because anything that was objective, this was not her sole explanation, but anything that's objective, everything needs to be subjective. Well, the problem is, then you removed meaning and context and for everything you do. You can make any word be anything you want it to be. And we've just lost control of society.
Yeah.
If we can't say 2 + 2 is 4, she was saying, well, to some kids, 2 + 2 might be 5, and that's okay. And I'm like, no, it's not okay. You're not helping a child by teaching them principles that they are not going to be able to live by.
Mm-hmm.
It may make people feel better in the moment, but this whole idea, this is how it's become very toxic, is, if you'll notice, it's all because of this BIPOC. If students are failing, they don't need to, there's nothing here that says they need to look within themselves, their own habits, their own work ethic, their own pace of how their sense of urgency, all that, because that's all whiteness and it's all evil. And you are placed in that situation because of evil white people. You're failing because of white superiority or white supremacy. And so think about what that does. Then that makes an African-American student go, or has the potential to go, yeah, these white people, they've been trying to keep me down. I hate them. Mm-hmm. And so when you say diversity, equity, inclusion, that works against all that, because you're saying, I want special treatment. I don't want to be just included. I want advantages that are going to elevate me to have an outcome that's greater than what necessarily maybe I've worked for or otherwise I would have. But this equity, there's nothing equitable about that, about recognizing or blaming everybody or having a built-in excuse for failure based on the color of somebody's skin. Again, I'm wide open to saying I'm willing to sit down and analyze my biases and look at maybe where my own lens is skewed. But I serve in the nonprofit world every day, and the vast majority of people that we serve in Alabama are African-American populations. And we love the people we serve, and we recognize that there's challenges historically based on race, and I'm not denying that at all. But we all have to be accountable for the culture that we propagate, that we choose to live in, because everything we do and say in this body is going to bring about consequences, are going to bring about results. And it may not be results we want, but, my saying, it's always been, if I'm not getting the results that I want, then I need to do something else. I can't sit around and wallow in self-pity and blame other people for me being unable to get ahead in life.
Yeah. Any of your thoughts on this? Info at TonyCurryRadio.net. You can go ahead and headline it Mission Mighty. Keep in mind your mission, your mighty. Is Michael Coleman, the CEO of the Heart of Alabama Food Bank. We have another show called Bite by Bite, which we'll be doing next if you're listening on the Tony Curry Radio podcast and or the Tony Curry Radio internet show right here on Tony Curry Radio. Michael, till next week, brother. Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Curry Radio.